Before we dive into Sophia's shocking story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single episode. Every week we uncover real-life tales of courage, danger, and survival that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Comment below what you think you would do in her shoes and share this video to warn others about the hidden dangers lurking in our neighborhoods. Stay with us, because the stories you'll see here are raw, real, and unforgettable. Your journey starts now. Sophia grew up in a quiet neighborhood of Los Angeles, the kind of place where the sun would set over palm trees and the streets buzzed with the laughter of children playing after school. She lived with her mother, who worked long hours as a nurse, and her younger brother Daniel, who idolized her in a way that made her feel both proud and responsible. From the outside, their life seemed ordinary, almost serene, but the shadows of the city's darker side crept closer every day. Sophia had always been aware of the whispers in the alleys and the flickering lights of police cars patrolling her block. Yet she had never imagined that one day those shadows would reach her directly. Sophia was 16 when the gang first cast their net near her street. She was already a bright, determined girl, a student who dreamed of becoming a social worker so she could help children like herself who grew up in neighborhoods where hope was scarce. Her friends at school admired her optimism, the way she carried herself despite the hardships she and her family faced. Yet behind her confident smile, she carried a quiet awareness of the dangers lurking in her community. Stories circulated at school of young girls and boys who had disappeared, never to be seen again. Rumors that were dismissed as exaggerations by adults, but felt alarmingly real to the teenagers living on the edges of those streets. Sophia had always been careful. She avoided walking alone late at night, stayed away from certain blocks, and never gave much attention to the older boys who loitered around corners and parks. But the MS-13 gang was persistent, a presence that could not be ignored. They had established a reputation that stretched far beyond Los Angeles, a network of violence and control that preyed on the most vulnerable. They were known for their tattoos, their cold eyes, and the brutality with which they enforced loyalty and fear. Sophia had heard stories, small fragments that circulated through whispers among her classmates, girls forced into prostitution, boys recruited for drug trafficking, families threatened and intimidated into silence. It was terrifying, yet at 16 the danger always felt distant, almost like a story from another world. Her neighborhood was slowly changing. More police cars patrolled the streets, but the gang adapted faster than the law could respond. Their graffiti, crude but unmistakable, began to appear on walls near Sophia's school, marking territory with symbols that conveyed ownership and threat. Some of her neighbors whispered that refusing to acknowledge the gang's presence was more dangerous than any confrontation. For Sophia, it was unsettling, but she clung to the routines that made her life feel safe. School, homework, visits to her best friend's house, and evenings spent watching the sun dip below the horizon from her bedroom window. Sophia's mother noticed a change in her daughter in subtle ways. Sophia was more vigilant, more cautious, and occasionally she would come home with a strange tension in her shoulders, as if carrying an invisible burden. Her mother asked questions, but Sophia often shrugged it off, attributing it to the stresses of teenage life. Yet deep down, she knew that the calm of their home was fragile, that the safety they had always taken for granted could be shattered by the wrong encounter with the wrong person. The first sign that the gang had taken notice of her came in the form of small, almost innocuous interactions. At school, a boy she didn't recognize lingered near her locker, offering compliments that made her uneasy. "You're different," he said once, his voice smooth but with an undertone that set her instincts on alert. He never threatened her directly, but the way he watched her felt invasive, predatory. Sophia mentioned it to her friends, who told her not to worry, that he was probably just interested. But the unease gnawed at her, a subtle alarm bell that something more serious was looming. One afternoon, walking home with Daniel, Sophia noticed a group of older boys at the corner of her street, their jackets dark, faces partially hidden by hoods. They laughed among themselves, but when their eyes met hers, the laughter stopped. It was a fleeting moment, a glance charged with unspoken intent, but it was enough for Sophia to feel the icy grip of fear tighten around her chest. She quickened her pace, holding Daniel's hand tighter, her mind racing through every possible way to avoid a confrontation. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a reality that was slowly encroaching on the innocence of her teenage years. Despite the growing tension, Sophia refused to let fear dominate her life. She continued attending school, volunteering at the local community center, and dreaming of a future far from the streets that threatened to consume her. She knew that running away was not a solution. Her family depended on her, and her own sense of self demanded that she face the world with courage. But courage, she would soon learn, came at a price, and the gang's attention was not something that could be ignored or bargained with. The neighborhood whispered about the disappearances, the rumors of girls forced into prostitution for the gang, yet Sophia had never imagined that she would be next. She thought of her mother, working late shifts at the hospital, unaware of the silent threats stalking the streets, and of Daniel, whose admiration for her made the thought of harm unbearable. The city around her continued to pulse with life, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the shadows that crept closer, gathering strength in the alleys and parking lots where the sun barely reached. Sophia's life before the gang had been simple, filled with ordinary worries and teenage dreams, but the normalcy was fragile, a delicate surface that could be shattered by the harsh realities of a world ruled by fear, intimidation, and violence. And in that fragile balance, the first threads of a story that would end in tragedy began to weave themselves around her, silent, inevitable, and merciless. Sophia's first real encounter with the MS-13 gang was not a dramatic confrontation, at least not at first. It began in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that hinted at the danger she was about to face. One warm afternoon, as she walked home from school, carrying her backpack heavy with textbooks and dreams, a group of older teenagers leaned against the corner store near her street. Their jackets were dark, adorned with tattoos and symbols that she didn't fully understand, but recognized instinctively as marks of territory. They spoke among themselves in low voices, but when their eyes landed on her, the conversation stopped. It was a silence that screamed, a presence that filled the space around her like a shadow she could not escape. One of the boys stepped forward. He was tall, with a lean frame, and the tattoos snaking up his arms hinted at a life lived on the edge or beyond it. "Hey, girl," he called out casually, as if greeting a neighbor. But Sophia's instincts screamed that it was anything but casual. She quickened her pace, glancing around for escape routes, but the street was unusually empty. The boy smiled, but there was a sharpness to it, a cruel amusement that made her stomach churn. "You know you'd be perfect for us," he said, the words slipping casually into the air, but weighted with menace. Sophia froze for a moment, disbelief mingling with fear. She had heard stories of girls being coerced into prostitution, of young women forced to serve the gang in ways that were cruel and inhumane. The rumors she had dismissed as distant threats suddenly felt dangerously close. She tried to shake her head, muttering an excuse, something to avoid confrontation, but the boy persisted. "Don't pretend you don't know what I mean," he said, stepping closer. His friends laughed softly, a sound that made Sophia's heart race. The intimidation was deliberate, carefully measured. This was not a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated test of power, a way to gauge her reaction, to see if she could be broken. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but Sophia's determination flared. She straightened her shoulders, her eyes meeting his as firmly as she could. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The boy tilted his head, as if assessing whether she was lying, whether she was bluffing. "Don't play games, girl," he said. "We know you. You're on our block now. You belong to us, whether you like it or not." The words struck her like ice. Belonging to them did not mean friendship or protection. It meant control, submission, and ultimately violence for those who resisted. Sophia turned, clutching her backpack tighter, and began walking faster. The boy and his friends did not chase her. At least not yet, but the threat lingered in the air behind her, invisible yet suffocating. She could feel their eyes on her back, calculating, waiting. By the time she reached her front door, her hands were trembling and her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her mother was not home, and she knew better than to tell her anything she couldn't protect her from. That night, she lay awake, replaying the encounter in her mind, every word and gesture etched with the sharp clarity of danger. Over the next weeks, the encounters became more frequent. The gang's attention was persistent, invasive. Boys would appear in unexpected places, outside the community center where she volunteered, at the park where she walked Daniel home, even near her school, always just far enough to be seen, but close enough to make their presence felt. Each encounter was a reminder that she was being watched, evaluated, and that her refusal to submit would come with consequences. The intimidation was psychological as much as it was physical. They wanted her to feel trapped, isolated, and powerless, a young girl whose life was slowly being circumscribed by fear. Sophia's friends noticed the changes. She began avoiding certain streets, changed her walking routes, and spoke less about her day. Her eyes carried a tension that had not been there before, a quiet alertness born of survival instincts honed by repeated exposure to threat. She knew that any misstep, any sign of weakness, could be used against her. And yet, even as fear seeped into her daily life, she refused to let it define her. Her resolve hardened. She would not be coerced into something that violated her dignity and her dreams. The gang, of course, noticed her resistance. That resistance became a challenge to their authority, a spark that demanded retaliation. In their world, submission was mandatory. Refusal was unacceptable. The intimidation escalated from casual threats to explicit warnings. One afternoon, a note was slipped under the door of her home. "You belong to us. You know what happens next." The handwriting was crude, jagged, the letters bleeding onto the paper as if the writer had pressed too hard. Sophia recognized immediately the implications. They had marked her, staking a claim over her life and threatening the ultimate punishment for her defiance. Despite the growing terror, Sophia tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She continued to attend school, volunteered at the community center, and spent time with Daniel. Each step outside her door was measured, each interaction carefully considered, yet the reality was inescapable. The gang's shadow followed her like a storm cloud, dark and relentless. Her innocence had been irrevocably pierced, and the world she once navigated with confidence now demanded vigilance, cunning, and constant awareness of threats that no teenager should ever have to face. Sophia's first encounter with the gang was the beginning of a series of events that would slowly consume her world. It was the moment when the ordinary and the extraordinary collided, when the safety of home, school, and family was shattered by the intrusion of organized violence. The encounter revealed the raw power of MS-13, the way fear was weaponized, and how resistance, however brave, could provoke unimaginable consequences. By the end of that first month, Sophia's life was a tightrope walk over a chasm of danger. She had been warned, tested, and found unwilling to submit. The gang had taken notice of her strength, but in their eyes, strength in a victim was a threat to their dominance. And in the world of MS-13, threats were eliminated swiftly and mercilessly. Sophia's refusal to bow to the gang's coercion became a quiet rebellion, a dangerous defiance that only fueled the MS-13's interest in her. Every step she took was calculated, every glance over her shoulder a reminder that the shadows she had first sensed were no longer distant. They were actively pursuing her. She began to navigate her world with a new awareness, a vigilance that bordered on paranoia, but it was necessary. Survival was now a daily exercise in courage, a test of resolve that she faced without flinching. At school, Sophia kept her head down, focusing on her studies, using the structure of classrooms and hallways as shields against the outside threats. She avoided areas where older students loitered and limited her social interactions to a trusted circle of friends who understood the gravity of her situation. Even casual conversations became strategic. She learned to read subtle cues, signs that someone might be connected to the gang, and to steer clear without revealing fear. Her defiance was quiet but visible. She refused to be intimidated, refused to let her life be commandeered by those who thrived on control. Sophia also took proactive steps to protect herself. She attended self-defense classes offered by a local community center and began learning about situational awareness, the subtle art of recognizing danger before it arrived. Every day, she rehearsed exit strategies in her mind, memorized the safest routes to school and home, and even considered temporary relocation options. Her determination to resist was paired with careful planning, a combination of courage and strategy that kept her a step ahead of those who sought to harm her. Her mother noticed the changes and became increasingly concerned. Sophia, usually open about her daily life, had grown secretive, wary of sharing too much. One evening after dinner, her mother pressed gently, "Sophia, is something happening? You've been different lately." Sophia shook her head, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just school stuff," she replied. But even as she spoke, her mind raced. She could not reveal the truth. Not yet. Her mother's safety and perhaps her own depended on silence. To speak of MS-13 in their neighborhood was to invite scrutiny, to risk bringing violence into their home. The gang escalated their tactics slowly at first, testing her resolve. They left messages, ambiguous and threatening, near places she frequented. A note tucked under the door at the community center, a scratch of symbols etched into the wall near the bus stop, the faint but unmistakable trace of their presence. Sophia understood the language of intimidation. Each act was calculated to instill fear, to wear her down, to break her will. Yet she did not waver. She refused to submit, refusing to allow her body or her life to be commodified for the gang's purposes. Her strength was a defiance that the gang would not easily forgive. Sophia also reached out cautiously for support. She confided in a mentor at the community center, a woman who had helped other teenagers navigate the dangers of gang life. Together, they discussed ways to protect her, strategies to minimize exposure, and the realities of confronting a gang known for brutality and ruthlessness. Her mentor warned her repeatedly about the risks, but Sophia's resolve was unshakable. She understood that fear was a tool the gang wielded, and to give in would mean surrendering not just her autonomy, but her dignity, her identity, and her dreams. Despite her careful maneuvers, the gang's scrutiny never lessened. Sophia could feel their presence in the streets, in the parks, even in fleeting interactions with strangers whose casual glances seemed charged with silent threats. She began documenting incidents, noting times, locations, and descriptions, creating a mental record that she hoped might be useful if law enforcement became involved. Every day was a balance of courage and caution, resistance and survival, a tightrope over a landscape dominated by fear and violence. Sophia's defiance became a subtle form of resistance against the culture of domination that the gang represented. By refusing to comply, she challenged their authority in a world where obedience was mandatory and dissent was punished with cruelty. Her life became a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming threat, an example of human resilience against the machinery of fear. Yet with each act of defiance, the danger grew exponentially. The gang did not tolerate opposition. They demanded control, and any refusal was a provocation that could escalate into violence. At home, Sophia's nights were restless. She double-checked locks, monitored who came and went from the street, and devised contingency plans for every possible scenario. She spoke to Daniel in coded warnings, teaching him to notice danger, to avoid attention, and to trust instinct. In her mind, every day was a survival lesson, a rehearsal for potential encounters that could turn lethal in an instant. Her life had transformed from the ordinary rhythm of a teenager into a battlefield of vigilance and courage, where every decision carried weight and consequence. Through all this, Sophia clung to her dreams and her sense of self. She refused to let the gang strip away her future, her ambition, and her belief in a world beyond fear. She dreamed of college, of a life dedicated to helping others like herself, to breaking cycles of violence and poverty. Her defiance was not just about survival, it was about retaining the essence of who she was, about asserting that even in the face of terror, she could choose her own path. Yet even as she maneuvered through the streets with caution, sought counsel, and fortified herself mentally and physically, the MS-13 gang's presence remained a looming shadow. Every act of resistance carried an unspoken warning. The gang did not forgive, and the cost of defiance could be the ultimate price. Sophia knew that her courage placed her directly in their sights, that each day was a negotiation between survival and autonomy. Her life, once ordinary, had been irrevocably altered. She had stepped into a world of shadows and threats, a world where violence was both a weapon and a language, where survival demanded courage, strategy, and constant vigilance. Standing up against the gang had defined her existence, revealing the extraordinary strength within an ordinary teenager and setting the stage for the events that would ultimately determine her fate. As the weeks passed, Sophia's life became increasingly dominated by the MS-13 gang's shadow, a presence that was no longer subtle but oppressive, almost suffocating. The subtle warnings and veiled threats she had previously encountered escalated into direct intimidation. Her neighborhood, once familiar and seemingly safe, began to feel like a cage, each street corner and alleyway a potential threat. The gang's reputation for brutality was well known, and the fear it inspired extended beyond rumor. Every act of defiance she displayed seemed to provoke them further, turning her life into a high-stakes game where one wrong step could prove fatal. One afternoon, as she walked home from the community center with Daniel at her side, Sophia noticed a group of gang members lingering near the corner store. Unlike previous encounters, there was no pretense of casual conversation. Their eyes followed her, measuring, calculating, predatory. One of the older boys, whose tattoos were an intricate web of symbols and numbers marking him as an established member, stepped forward and called out her name. "Sophia," he said, voice low and edged with menace. "You keep thinking you can ignore us, but we see everything. You know what we want. Don't test us." The words were not a threat, they were a promise. Sophia's heart raced, but she refused to show panic. She forced herself to respond with a calm that she did not feel. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though the lie was thin and vulnerable. The gang member's gaze sharpened, and a silent message passed among the others. Sophia understood immediately. Her refusal had been noted, and their patience was wearing thin. The intimidation grew increasingly personal. They left notes on her doorstep, scrawled with crude handwriting and symbols that carried explicit meaning in the gang's code. Some were simple warnings, "You belong to us." Others were more sinister, sketches of weapons and phrases implying punishment for disobedience. One morning, she found a small package on her doorstep, its contents a chilling reminder of what could happen if she continued to resist. A lock of hair and a note that read, "This is what happens to those who defy us." Sophia froze, the weight of terror pressing down on her chest. But even in that moment, her resolve did not waver. She had to remain strong, not just for herself, but for Daniel, and for the vision of the life she refused to surrender. The gang's harassment became relentless, infiltrating spaces that had once been safe. Sophia began noticing suspicious figures outside the community center where she volunteered, cars following her routes home, and strangers whose casual glances felt like calculated threats. Every interaction became a potential danger, every street a landscape of risk. She adapted quickly, changing routines, avoiding predictable paths, and relying on friends and allies for support when she could. Each day became a careful balance of courage and caution, as if navigating a labyrinth where the walls themselves were alive with menace. Despite these precautions, the psychological toll on Sophia was immense. Sleep became difficult. Nightmares plagued her nights, replaying threats and imagined scenarios of abduction or worse. She became hyper-aware of every sound near her home, every vehicle passing by, every shadow stretching across the sidewalk. Yet, in her mind, giving in was not an option. Submission would mean losing her dignity, her dreams, and the very essence of who she was. She had to remain steadfast, even as the danger escalated beyond anything she had imagined. The gang's tactics evolved into more direct threats. One evening, as Sophia returned from volunteering, she found a group waiting near her usual route, blocking her path. They did not speak at first, only stared with cold eyes, marking her as their prey. Then one stepped forward and said, "You know the rules. We own this neighborhood, and now we own you. You can run, but you can't hide." His tone carried the certainty of someone who had taken lives before. Sophia swallowed hard, forcing herself to walk past them with a steady pace, refusing to show fear. The encounter left her shaken, but it also reinforced the stakes of her defiance. Every day she had to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast a group of people whose capacity for violence was terrifyingly real. Sophia also faced threats in the digital world. Anonymous messages began appearing on her social media accounts, warnings and insults aimed to intimidate her and isolate her from friends. The gang understood that control was not just physical, but psychological. They sought to erode her confidence and make her feel trapped, constantly watched, and powerless. She deleted accounts, changed her routines online, and grew increasingly vigilant, but the invasive presence remained a constant reminder that her safety was always in jeopardy. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Sophia's courage and resourcefulness shone through. She sought counsel from mentors at the community center, sharing what she could without endangering herself or her family. They devised plans to improve her safety, including varying her routes, avoiding solitary walks, and establishing safe points along the way. Sophia learned to trust her instincts above all else, reading micro-expressions, body language, and subtle cues that indicated danger. She became adept at navigating the precarious world the gang had imposed on her life. Yet, the reality was unrelenting. The MS-13 gang's persistence was a dark force that could not easily be shaken. Their threats were no longer subtle. They had crossed a line where intimidation was a daily occurrence, escalating toward the inevitable confrontation that Sophia had feared since the first encounter. Each warning, each symbol, each shadow in the street was a reminder that defiance came with a cost she was unwilling to pay by surrendering her will, but which the gang might enforce by other means. As the days grew heavier, Sophia's inner strength became her armor. She learned to mask fear with composure, to act with caution while maintaining a sense of normalcy, and to prepare for contingencies without succumbing to despair. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger more palpable, yet she refused to be silenced. The escalation of threats from the gang was relentless, but Sophia's courage and defiance were unwavering, setting the stage for the tragic events that loomed closer with each passing day. The night of the attack arrived quietly, almost deceptively so, as if the city itself held its breath. Sophia had spent the day carefully navigating her routines, checking and rechecking the safest paths. ensuring Daniel was safely home with their mother, and trying to convince herself that her vigilance might be enough to keep the gang at bay. Yet, the MS-13 gang was patient, methodical, and relentless. They had been watching, waiting for the right moment to make their presence impossible to ignore, and Sophia's defiance had painted a target on her back that could not be erased. It was late evening when Sophia decided to walk home from the community center, a route she had taken countless times. The streets were dimly lit, shadows pooling in corners and behind parked cars, creating pockets of darkness where danger could hide. Her senses were heightened, every sound amplified. The creak of a gate, the distant roar of a car engine, footsteps that didn't match the rhythm of the street. She had hoped that her careful planning and past vigilance might protect her. But the gang had chosen this moment with chilling precision. From the shadows, a group emerged. They were silent at first, slipping out from alleyways and behind cars, their presence unnoticed until it was too late. Sophia felt the sudden chill of fear as they surrounded her, cutting off every escape route. The figures were unmistakable, tattoos marking their allegiance to MS-13, eyes cold and unyielding, movements coordinated and predatory. It was no longer a warning, no longer an intimidation tactic. It was the execution of a plan she had known was always possible, but had hoped would never come to pass. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to move, to find a way past them, but they had anticipated her every action. One of the older boys, the same who had first singled her out weeks before, stepped forward, a cruel smile playing across his face. "You should have listened," he said, voice low and venomous. "You belong to us." His words were a confirmation of everything Sophia had feared. There was no negotiation, no chance for escape, only the stark reality of the violence they were capable of unleashing. Sophia's mind raced. She thought of Daniel, of her mother, of the dreams that had sustained her through weeks of fear and preparation. She refused to give in verbally, to allow them the satisfaction of seeing her broken, yet the physical reality of the attack was immediate and terrifying. They advanced, a coordinated, merciless wave of aggression that left her few options. Every instinct she had honed over weeks, self-defense maneuvers, strategic thinking, situational awareness, was tested to its limit, yet they outmatched her in sheer numbers and experience. The assault was swift and brutal. Sophia fought with everything she had, each movement an act of desperation and courage, but the gang's strength and coordination overwhelmed her. There was a terrifying efficiency in the violence, a cold precision honed over countless acts of intimidation and brutality. Every strike, every shove was a calculated message, a reminder that defiance came with a deadly price. Sophia's courage, remarkable in its steadfastness, met the harsh reality of a gang willing to kill to assert control. Even in the midst of the attack, Sophia's mind was sharp. She thought of Daniel, imagining him safe at home, and of the community she had tried to protect herself within. Her last thoughts were not of fear, but of determination, an unspoken refusal to allow them to claim her spirit, even if they succeeded in taking her life. The gang's violence was physical, but Sophia's resilience, her courage, her refusal to submit, remained intact in her consciousness, even as her body was overcome. Neighbors later described the scene with horror. The streets were silent, save for the echoes of confrontation, the sudden eruption of violence breaking the ordinary calm of the neighborhood. Sophia's body was discovered later, a tragic testament to the extremity of the gang's cruelty and the stakes of defiance in a world where power was enforced through terror. Law enforcement would later confirm that the attack had been premeditated, the culmination of weeks of observation, intimidation, and calculated pressure aimed at a young woman who had dared to refuse submission. The impact on her family was profound. Her mother, devastated by the loss, struggled with the knowledge that the danger had always been near, hidden in the ordinary rhythms of life until it erupted with fatal consequence. Daniel, too young to fully grasp the events, carried a void where Sophia's guidance and presence had been. The community was shaken, realizing that the threat of gang violence was not just theoretical or distant, but immediate, capable of destroying life with alarming efficiency. Sophia's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a symbol of the brutality inherent in gangs like MS-13, a stark reminder of the human cost of organized violence. Her courage in standing up to them became both her defining trait and the reason she was targeted. In the aftermath, local authorities increased patrols and initiated investigations, attempting to bring justice. Yet the fear instilled by the gang remained, a lingering shadow over the streets she had once walked freely. Through news reports, community discussions, and social media awareness, Sophia's story spread, touching the lives of those who might not have otherwise understood the daily reality of living under gang threats. She became, posthumously, a figure representing resistance, courage, and the tragic consequences of defying criminal organizations. Her name carried weight, a narrative used to illustrate the dangers faced by vulnerable youth and the critical need for community vigilance, law enforcement intervention, and programs aimed at prevention and protection. Even in death, Sophia's defiance resonated. She had refused to surrender her body, her dignity, and her will to a gang that demanded obedience. Her story, horrific in its conclusion, highlighted the extraordinary courage required to stand against such forces and the devastating price that resistance can exact in a world where violence is a tool of power. The night of the attack, though it ended in tragedy, also illuminated the resilience of the human spirit, the bravery of a young woman who refused to be broken, and the urgent, ongoing struggle against gang violence that continues to claim innocent lives. The aftermath of Sophia's death rippled through her family, friends, and the community like a shockwave, leaving devastation in its wake and a sobering reminder of the brutal reality of gang violence. Her mother, consumed by grief, struggled to reconcile the ordinary routines of life with the incomprehensible loss of her daughter. Daniel, her younger brother, faced a void that could never be filled, a daily reminder that the safety and innocence of youth could be obliterated by forces beyond their control. But amidst the sorrow, Sophia's story began to take on a life of its own, transcending tragedy to become a symbol of resistance, courage, and the urgent need for awareness. Local authorities increased their presence in the neighborhood, but it was not just law enforcement that responded. Community leaders, educators, and social workers recognized that Sophia's death could not be viewed in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern of gang exploitation and violence, a cycle that preyed on the most vulnerable: young women, marginalized families, and teenagers who sought only to survive and dream. Her story became a case study, illustrating the methods of intimidation, coercion, and brutality employed by MS-13 and similar criminal organizations, and the devastating consequences of defiance. Schools and community centers began holding discussions about gang awareness, safety, and resilience, using Sophia's story as both a warning and a lesson. Educators spoke candidly to students about the dangers of gangs, the importance of vigilance, and the need to seek help when faced with threats. They emphasized that courage, like Sophia had displayed, was admirable, but that survival sometimes required strategic action, alliances, and communication with trusted adults. Her story served as a catalyst, sparking conversations that might save lives and prevent similar tragedies. In the broader public sphere, Sophia's case became part of a conversation about the impact of organized crime on urban communities. Journalists and writers recounted her story in detail, painting a picture of a young girl whose defiance of exploitation cost her life, yet whose courage demanded recognition. Her story was cited in discussions about the importance of community support networks, early intervention programs, and the provision of safe spaces for at-risk youth. Advocacy groups used her example to push for stronger protections for young women targeted by gangs and for increased resources for law enforcement to dismantle criminal networks. Sophia's legacy also resonated on a deeply personal level. Friends and family created memorials in her honor, spaces where her memory could inspire rather than just mourn. Small shrines, gatherings, and public tributes celebrated her strength and defiance, reminding the community that while she had been lost to senseless violence, her life had meaning beyond its tragic end. These acts of remembrance reinforced the message that one life, even in death, could galvanize awareness, education, and action against systemic threats like gang exploitation. Importantly, Sophia's story highlighted the broader social issues surrounding gangs like MS-13, poverty, marginalization, lack of access to education, and the vulnerabilities that criminal organizations exploit. Social workers and policymakers drew attention to these systemic problems, advocating for initiatives that provided alternatives to gang life, empowered at-risk youth, and fostered environments where defiance could be met with support rather than violence. Sophia became a symbol not only of tragedy, but also of the pressing need for social intervention to break the cycles that enable such violence to persist. Her story also served as a cautionary tale for young women across Los Angeles and beyond. It reinforced the message that coercion and exploitation are not just possibilities in abstract. They are real, immediate threats in certain neighborhoods. Yet it also emphasized the power of courage, integrity, and resistance, and the importance of channels that can support those who stand against oppression. Sophia's defiance, though it ended in death, became a rallying point for awareness campaigns, community vigilance, and advocacy against the predatory practices of gangs. In retrospect, the impact of Sophia's life and death cannot be measured solely in the hours she lived or the violent way she was taken. Her existence had forced a community to confront uncomfortable truths, to recognize the fragility of safety in neighborhoods plagued by organized crime, and to question what could be done to protect the most vulnerable. Her story became a touchstone, a narrative used in schools, social programs, and local campaigns to illustrate both the human cost of gang violence and the extraordinary courage required to resist it. Through memorials, journalism, advocacy, and community action, Sophia's legacy endured. Her story reminded everyone that behind statistics and news reports are individual lives full of potential, dreams, and unyielding strength. It demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming terror, resistance matters, that courage, integrity, and defiance against exploitation have value, even if paid with the ultimate price. Sophia's life, though tragically cut short, became a beacon, a narrative of awareness and remembrance that demanded the attention of her community and of society at large. The lessons of Sophia's story continue to resonate. Parents, teachers, and community leaders speak of her as an example of bravery, a young woman who refused to surrender to coercion, who fought to retain her dignity in the face of unimaginable threat. Her narrative serves as a warning, an educational tool, and a call to action, reminding communities that vigilance, solidarity, and intervention are essential in the fight against gangs like MS-13. While the gang's shadow remains over many neighborhoods, the memory of Sophia stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring need to protect and empower those who are most vulnerable. In the end, Sophia's story is more than a tale of tragedy. It is a legacy of courage, a call to awareness, and a challenge to society to confront the realities of gang violence head-on. Her life, defiant and brave to the very end, inspires vigilance, education, and action. It reminds everyone that even in darkness, the impact of one determined, courageous individual can echo far beyond their years, shaping the consciousness of a community and demanding that change, justice, and awareness continue to grow.